Well, welcome today to this is one of a series of topics on baroque performance practice. This one specifically is looking at a French treatise and thinking about what things in that. Some things are not going to be so relevant. There's an element where we are still playing modern instruments unless we are specialists. We're playing specific baroque instruments. We're playing modern instruments. We have a modern audience. So there's this, the cultural context is quite different to a baroque cultural context. But sometimes we can see symbols on the page or see music and not really know how it was interpreted in those days. So having a look at some treatises should give us some ideas for how we can approach music now that was written back then. So I tested this out and it worked just before. So now if I press ears, you should see the screen. Did it work? Maybe? We're just waiting to make sure that you can see the PowerPoint. Yes, it's up. Excellent. Okay. So first, Francis Couperin. So his dates are 1668 to 1733. So, you know, mid Baroque era. So he's a French Baroque composer. He's an organist and a harpsichordist. His father, I put this in because this is quite a weird fact for us, but his father, who was the church organist of the Church of Saint Gervais, and I probably said that very authentically in French. I apologize to anybody who actually speaks French. So his father died when he was 11. And by virtue of the practice, he just inherited his father's job. So at age 11, he was the church organist, but because of his age, there was some arrangement with another adult to basically train him up in the job as well. So why this treatise? Why was this a treatise I picked? Because it's about harpsichord technique. The first thought is, oh, well, that's not so useful. However, there's stuff about performance style, fingering practices. So in this era of the Baroque, for those who don't know, the fingering practices were changing. And that's why if we look at, we are going to look at CPE Bark's treatise down the future. And they spend so much time talking about why they think fingering, where you put your thumb under and you do these sorts of things, is so valuable. They spend a lot of time on it because at this stage, those things that we take as for granted weren't part of common practice. So he talks about phrasing and he talks about ornamentation. So there's four things here that we can apply today. And of course, this helps us understand the French. I've written late Baroque in here, probably should have written mid-Baroque, mid to late anyway. So I thought this was interesting that he says something that we all take for granted today. But he says that, unlike us, we have X-rays, we have so much physiological research. When he's speaking, it's almost intuition. So I thought it was worth mentioning that he says, in order to be seated at the correct height, the underside of the elbows, the wrists and the fingers must be all on one level. So in other words, there must be an alignment. So one must choose a chair that agrees with this rule. It will be necessary to put something of a suitable height under a young, that's probably pupil's feet, measured by their growth so their feet are not dangling in the air and so they can keep their bodies properly balanced. Now, this comment is so true. And when I'm examining, I so often see students who are too low, so their elbows are dangling, their feet are dangling, so their lower spine is not balanced. But here in 1700, we have somebody who's hitting that nail on the head. This is what's required for a balanced playing. Now, INEGALE, this is the big thing. This is the thing that for us, we don't really deal with, but actually we do, if we really think about it, because we play those modernized, stylized jazz works, which use what they often write at the time, using a swung rhythm or using jazz INEGALE. So we do use INEGALE, but INEGALE is something that when we look at Baroque music, we don't think about. So Couperin says about INEGALE, There are defects in our method of writing music which correspond to our manner of writing our language. We write differently from the way we play. So we're going to look at INEGALE in quite a lot of detail. So when a French composer writes equal quavers, they're to be played as limping or lilting, he says. So a long short. Although the long value is similar to swung quavers, the note can be longer, pushing the note even shorter. So in comparison to jazz, that's what's trying to make a point. In comparison to jazz, where we sort of have it's almost divided into threes: crotchet, quaver, crotchet, quaver. When we're seeing where quavers written, there's flexibility in the length of the crotchet in this. So, and I've just said what I said before. So two note slurs might, on stepwise movement, might be used to indicate INEGALE. In other contexts and other treatises, two note slurs on stepwise movement actually mean don't use INEGALE. So that makes things a little bit confusing when we're looking at early music. So in Couperin's case, a slur that covers more than two notes is indicating that we're actually going to play the quavers equally, the way we're used to playing them. Now, he uses the term couler for when the rhythm goes short-long instead of long-short. So, well, sorry, this is smaller text than I realized. So what is INEGALE used for? Well, it's used for when we've got continuous stepwise movement. Stepwise is in moving by seconds, not leaps and larger intervals. So only moving by seconds. And when the notes are equal in value, that is when they're all quavers. It also only applies if the note is smaller than the value of the beat. So if we're in 4/4 time, the beat is a crotchet. So the notes that INEGALE would be applied to needs to be on the quavers or semiquavers, not on minims and crotchets. And INEGALE is used for notes which are slurred in pairs in Couperin's context. We don't use INEGALE on triplets, don't use it on syncopations, which is again different to jazz, where they do keep the swung quavers even across a syncopated rhythm. Don't use INEGALE in fast tempos. And as I said, don't use INEGALE over large intervals. When we talk about large intervals, we're talking about a third and greater. Don't use INEGALE on repeated notes. Also, don't use INEGALE over slurs of three or more notes. And don't use INEGALE where the note value is variable in the section. I don't actually remember what I meant by that. And when they use staccato dots, that indicates play the notes equally. It doesn't necessarily mean play staccato. So we have to be careful with how dots are used and whether or not they are referring to equal playing or whether they're actually referring to the detachment of the notes. So then another thing that Couperin addresses is a concept of double dotting. So when there's a dot next to a note, its value is actually a little bit flexible. It's not like, oh, it's 1.5, the value of 1.5 of the written note. Double dots were not actually used. So a dotted rhythm could be played as approximately a double dotted one. Notice I said approximately because it wasn't a definite, oh yes, this is definitely to be played exactly double dotted. There was a flexibility, and I think in this treatise, I guess we'll cross it later if it is in this treatise, that the writer talks about when seeing a double dot, when seeing a single dot, sometimes you stretch it to much more than the length of the double dot even. Particularly in French overtures, when playing baroque music, that often comes up, and that importance to lengthen the dotted note. This particular treatise, Couperin doesn't really go into a lot of detail about ornamentation, but if you want to know more about ornamentation with Couperin, the place to look is this Premier Livre de Pieces de Clavecin. Now, he describes mordents as being long or short. So a short mordant we know, and a long mordant is something like a trill. It's quite different terminology. The pourdevoir is something that is not something we're particularly familiar with. It was much less common in German Baroque music, and that's a lower appoggiatura. It was very common to put a pourdevoir and then a mordant in French ornamentation. For those who haven't come to one of my talks on Baroque interpretation before, or aren't familiar with Baroque interpretation, the composers didn't generally write ornamentation. The French actually wrote a lot more than the Germans did. So there was this concept that the composers sort of basically only wrote the bare bones, and then you were to, as a performer, were to add the ornamentation. And there's certain treatises where you can see examples of a whole series of different French ornamentation. And pourdevoir is one that comes up in this treatise, and that's the lower appoggiatura. The passing appoggiatura should sound with the harmony note. Now, this is different to what we've covered in the quants treatise before, where a passing appoggiatura was before the beat. He's saying the passing appoggiatura should be on the beat. So mordants, according to Couperin, begin and end on the written note, but they can be short or long. Again, this is not how we typically would play a Baroque mordant, because how many times have we done, oh, they have to start on the upper note? Well, not according to this treatise. Appoggiaturas are to be played with the bass notes, and they take the value from the one that follows. So in other words, they're on the beat, and they steal value from the notes that come after. When the appoggiatura is repeating the note that goes before, change fingers on that note up. So if you are, again, this is something we take for granted. If you've got basically a repeated note, the note before then the appoggiatura is the same note, then use a different finger. And this was quite radical in his day, this new modern fingering. And trills are to be played slowly, more slowly than they end, but this gradation should be imperceptible. So start the trill slow, gradually increase in speed, but it needs to be basically so the audience doesn't really notice it's happening. That's something I feel in the exam room as well, that students have played this trill. And they've played the trill, but it doesn't organically blend, or they're trying to do an increasing speed trill, but it sounds unnatural. It's got to be this imperceptible organicness to all ornamentation and all speed changes. More ornaments. And then he says about trills. So mordants begin on the written note, but trills should always begin on the note above. And he divides the trill into three parts. He calls them the stress, repercussions, and the stopping point. And in this example, here's his trill on D, and here's the stress. So he's put a whole minim. So he's taken half of the value of this note. And then half the value of the note is that appoggiatura, which he's called the stress. This part, which is 1.5 counts, is the repercussions, or the actual trill, and then there's a stopping point to the trill. So that stopping point, again, that's something that I very rarely hear students play, but da 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 da, and then it's like, hey, make sure the listener knows what note that trill was on by elongating it at the end. Then he says something interesting about consecutive thirds, where you've got thirds in a row. And he says that they're traditionally played with fingers 2 and 4. Now, this is an interesting insight, because this indicates to us that in music before Couperin, when we see like scales in thirds or passages in thirds, that they're not played legato, because they're fingered with 2 and 4 over and over and over again. So Couperin suggests this concept of using a legato fingering. And, you know, again, legato fingering is we have to do it for grade 8, I think, in ABRSM, the scale in thirds using legato fingerings. But this is new and radical, to this mid-Baroque French era, to use a legato fingering. And when something's new, that probably means it's more important to almost exaggerate the legato-ness of it because it's the latest fashion, so to speak. Now, another misconception that often goes around is that Baroque music was very almost, we call it the sewing machine Baroque era, where Baroque music didn't have any flexibility of time. It was very metronomic, but that doesn't correspond to what's in the treatises actually. And Couperin actually says that the only reason he adds bar lines to his preludes is to aid in the learning process. However, when they're performed, he wants them to be played with freedom, just like poetry, which has prose and verse as part of it. When I was reading this treatise and thinking about this, I vaguely recall when I first started teaching, unfortunately it was a million years ago, but there was a book that was released, particularly without bar lines. The writer of the book felt that it was a beginner book, and they felt that bar lines made students pause. So he got rid of, or he or she got rid of all the bar lines, so the student wouldn't be pause on them. So I found it a bit comical that Couperin was basically using bar lines the opposite way, saying this is my educational tool. So and doing that first, but saying ignore them later. Wow, I think I got through this one very quickly because I'm up to my final slide already. It's a short treatise actually, but it has a lot of important stuff, in particular the stuff about INEGALE. So final words. It is necessary to preserve a perfect legato in all your playing, and all ornaments ought to be very precise. I just stop and go, wait a second, when we're dealing with other treatises, we're being told to use varied articulation, and that long legato is what amateurs do. So this is quite a contrast, the French music to the Germanic tradition here, that they're demanding this or desiring this perfect legato in all. And the ornaments need to be very precise. And those which are made up of repercussions, in other words, the trilling part, should be played evenly with an imperceptible speeding up. So starting the trill slow, getting faster, but playing them even so that the gradual speeding up is not able to be really recognized. Take care not to alter the rhythm in the regulated pieces, and do not let go of holding the notes before their time value is complete. And this is so contrary to stuff that we've talked about in other treatises and stuff we'll talk about in future treatises, where the written note was actually the maximum value of the note, and rather than being the actual value it had to hold for, it was the amount of time it took. So you could use your articulation to shorten it. So his concept is quite different in that. So actually, that was, I think, the quickest presentation I've ever given. I will stop sharing. And does anybody have any questions that they want to either ask? Unfortunately, if you ask a question, your voice will be on live stream. I apologize, but if you don't want your voice on live stream, feel free to ask a question in the chat. Pretty self-explanatory in a way. We don't frequently teach Baroque music. The treatise. The title of the treatise is the Art of Playing the Harpsichord is the translation. I'm sorry, I don't speak French. So Alfred's publications have actually got a translation of the treatise, so you don't need to read it in French. Or the French version is available on IMSLP for those who know more French than me, which is probably everyone in the room. Yeah, it is an interesting one because of the fact that it's so different to the Germanic tradition, and there's historical reasons why the Germanic tradition was so strong in our music education canon, and it is still so strong. But that's a very exciting historical topic and less relevant to the Zoom. and possibly a little bit speculative, but I think it's so great to introduce students to French music, because, and even sometimes we play some stylized French music if we're playing Bach minuets, and so there's some concept, well, Bach is near France, so there's some French elements in his compositions, particularly when he's trying to emulate French compositions. I've lost the chat. Now, Claire, I don't have any of that information. I don't know. I did try and get a time machine and go back and ask. But that raises an interesting point, that when someone writes a treatise, it doesn't necessarily fully reflect the rest of music at the time. It could be conservative, and it could be, or Couperin being fantastical. So he could be there writing, going, oh, I hate this modern music, and I want this, so I want to make this be the new canon, that we are preserving the old music. And definitely that was Quantz's writing quite late on, and very clearly wanting to, restore the high baroque and none of this rubbish modern music. So that happens. And then the other possibility is, of course, that he's going, well, wait a second, I want to make changes. And I would suggest that, by the way Couperin wrote, that he's more trying to make changes to education, go, wait a second, look at how good this new fingering is, and he's constantly comparing these new fingerings, which are now our standards, with the old fingerings and what the old fingerings achieved. And you would probably be aware that in the older fingerings, the thumb wasn't used, basically. So there was no passing under, which didn't matter if you were articulating. So if you're detaching notes, it was almost impossible not to detach notes because you were moving your hand. But now Couperin's saying, hey, well, this super legato. Now, does he mean super legato like we think about super legato, or is it relative to the context of the fact that there was a generally detached bass that music was working around? So yes, Claire, that's exactly, we just realized that we're sort of saying the same question. Don't have the answer to that. I was just talking about the treatise, not that there. So yeah, it's hard to know. It's always hard to know with the treatise exactly what the motivation for writing the treatise was and how far you can apply it. And that's been an issue with CPE's treatise in particular, that it's been applied way beyond its, the thing like every second shortest note should be detached in baroque. It's such a huge oversimplification based on something from CPE's treatise, and going to taking it beyond what it was supposed to mean. So, but we can never really be sure. Are they being conservative? Are they trying to make changes and like being a writer pretending that this is how everyone does everything, so that people read it go, oh yeah, of course I should do things that way. So, but definitely Quantz has to be read that way. Quantz is looking back. So yes, as to what other people thought, I can't answer that. But you can look it up and get back to me. Just saying, if you want homework, Claire, both Claires, I'm sure you do. But that's always something in every treatise we look at. We are going to be looking at that same thing. How much can it be applied? And that's not a fixed question. How far can you extend the application? So it's a debated question at all levels regarding most treatises. So the treatise that my thesis is on was written in 1720, but it's still talking about Gregorian chant, and it's talking about how to teach Gregorian chant, and so extremely rear focused. And by the time Spain finally got into the 18th century, the rest of Europe was probably going to the 19th century. But so yeah, always we take all treatises with a grain of salt while taking what we can use from them. And Couperin's wrote his own music books for teaching as well, right? So his treatises probably directly relate to playing his music and probably have to do with what he wants his students to know. But good questions, everybody. Any more before? Maybe I won't try and demonstrate INEGALE. There's more we can go into INEGALE with exactly how it's applied. And so I've noticed that a lot of musicians that would title themselves early musicians, as opposed to baroque players, because it wasn't alive in those days. But the early musicians will do the INEGALE by gradually extending the length within the bar. So they start with less INEGALE and put more in. It